expenditures. And I'm sure if there's questions, given that the Provincial Treasury is also on the line, they could provide more information in this regard, exactly how they went about it and what activities will be targeted in terms of those allocations. If you then go to the next slide, impact on COVID-19 pandemic on local government. There's been 11 billion made available through the local government equitable share, and then a further 9 billion has been repurposed towards the conditional grants towards COVID-19 related expenditures. And one of the things that we picked up right from the start in our discussions that we had with metropolitan municipalities, but also other municipalities, is that given that there's less economic activity, there's less electricity that's sold, there's less water and sanitation being sold. There's also people that, because of the lockdown restrictions, couldn't work. So there's a great possibility that many more people are going to become indigent because they're either going to have restricted work pay or going to lose their jobs. And that's going to increase the number of indigent that municipalities must serve. So given on that experience, and there's also, in addition to that, there's also specific COVID-19 related expenditure that cities and other municipalities also need to deal with. Specifically, one of the key things that came up the whole time is caring for the homeless, which is also putting quite substantial budget pressures on municipalities. To cater for those, 10 billion was made available to assist municipalities with regard to expenditure related to the poor and also the revenue loss that they losing, and also general activities towards COVID-19. And then 1 billion was specifically targeted towards expenditure regarding the homeless. And what the next, the bottom bullet then indicates is the additional responsibilities that was placed on municipalities also with regard to public transport, for example, where they were required to also ensure that sanitation requirements were met. Another area that we also picked up that's putting quite a lot of pressure on municipalities, and it shows that the country, although we've done a lot to address the backlogs in the country, there's still a lot that needs to be done because a lot of immediate action had to be taken towards the provision of water and sanitation facilities, in particular informal settlements that cropped up as to be quite a big problem. And the key point that we want to make here is that these interim solutions such as water tankering, using trucking as well, is very, very, very expensive and very cost inefficient. So this should be seen as an interim measure whilst municipalities then start focusing on more longer term sustainable solutions that's also more cost effective. Thank you. Then the next slide. And I've already taken you through most of these in quite a bit of detail. And so this is just a recap of what the Division of Revenue response is about. And it's specifically, of course, the Division of Revenue deals with the pressures in provinces and municipalities. And maybe a key point that we need to make here as well, we should not just expect national government to actually respond to this crisis, but and I've already indicated what is expected from provinces and how they are required to repurpose their equitable share. But the same is also required from municipalities. They should also look at their budgets and reprioritize and refocus their budgets towards COVID-19 related expenditure, because it's an all-of-government approach, and it's not, the burden shouldn't just be placed on national to respond to that. And we've done from our side, we've repurposed the conditional grants as well to allow us as much expenditure towards COVID-19 expenditure. What the next slide then just shows is just to assist committee members also how to read or what is happening in the Division of Revenue Amendment Bill. If you look at the top table, it shows you what is presented in the Regional 2020 Division of Revenue Act. It's got a column A that deals with this year's allocations, namely 2020-21 allocations, and then column B deals with the 2 outer years. What the 2020 Division of Revenue Amendment Bill deals with is just the 2020-21 allocations. So the first column would show you the regional allocation that was announced in the 2020 Division of Revenue Act. And then the second column would then show the adjustment. Of course, if it's a clean amount, then no change have taken place. If there's a plus in front of the amount, of course, it's addition. And if there's a minus, then it shows you a reduction. So what we've done is it shows with regard to national, its allocation in terms of its share, which includes in this instance also the provincial and local government conditional grants. It increased by 32 billion. The provincial equitable share was not changed, and the local government equitable share was increased by 11 billion. But if you look at the individual grants, you would also read it exactly the same. So it will, and later in the presentation, we'll go through the allocations with regard to KZN in particular. If I can then now hand over to Emmanuel Pillay, that will take you through the provincial changes. Thank you very much. Emmanuel, over to you.
Thanks, Wendy. Emmanuel, are you there?
Yes.
Okay, you can proceed.
Okay. So thanks, Wendy, and thank you, Chair. Good morning to the members. So just in terms of the conditional grant allocations, there have been 3 basic changes. There have been additions, there have been some cuts on some grants, and there have been some repurposing within conditional grants. So if we just go quickly through the slides, the first slide deals mostly with the health changes. And I suppose because it's a health pandemic affecting mostly the health sector, there has been some funds allocated to the health conditional grant, which is the HIV and AIDS, TB and malaria grant. So what has happened here is we've included a new component called the COVID-19 component. So 2.8 billion rand has been added for all provinces. And this is to cater for PPE, ventilators, and also for the hiring of staff, especially including the Cuban medical personnel that were brought in to assist with the pandemic response. So out of the 2.8 billion rand, 446 million is for KZN. So KZN did quite a large portion of that, 446 million on that. In terms of grants where they were not cuts exactly, but the funds were used to or were repurposed to respond to the pandemic. So the first one was the component within the HIV and AIDS grant, which is called the Community Outreach Services component. So it has just been repurposed. So this component is basically to perform outreach in terms of HIV and TB and malaria in the normal purpose. But because of the repurposing of part of this component, it will be used for contact tracing in terms of COVID-19. The health facilities revitalization grant. So there has also been issues in terms of concerns about limited bed space, especially when coming to intensive care when the virus peaks. So part of this funds, 1.1 billion of these funds have been repurposed to assist to upgrade and refurbish facilities. So it's basically to increase bed space, and especially to cater for the additional patients that might come through during the peak of the pandemic. Also, 298 million rand has been repurposed within the National Tertiary Services Grant for intensive care capacity enhancement. So this can also be used, for example, for procuring of specialists. So your cardiologists, whichever specialist that needs to be procured during this time, especially during the peak, can be used for the funds from the grant can be used to procure those specialists. If you go to the next slide, please. Okay, sorry, I just can't see. Yeah, thanks. Okay, thanks. So education, there haven't been any additions as such, but there has been some repurposing within the grant. I suppose the first one is the 600 million was taken away from the education infrastructure grant and moved to the indirect school infrastructure backlog grant. Now, obviously, indirect doesn't means that the funds are being administered by the national department and not the province anymore. So this will be used for providing water and also for providing of water tanks in schools where they don't have water. And this is vitally important, especially during the pandemic, with the washing of hands and sanitation, especially. So just a point to note here is that although we say money is being moved from the education infrastructure grant to the indirect grant, it doesn't necessarily mean that KZN is losing the money. Because if you go towards the end of the bill itself, you will see how the education infrastructure backlog grant, which is the indirect grant, is earmarked for all provinces. So what's happening here is that although the money has been taken away as a direct grant, it's still being earmarked for KZN. So that money, which amounts to 196 billion of the 600 billion for KZN, will be used for schools in KZN. It won't be used for any schools in other provinces, for example. Okay. Within the education infrastructure grant, which is a direct grant to provinces, as Wendy indicated earlier, a lot of these grants could not do much in the first 3 months of the pandemic during the lockdown, especially in terms of construction and maintenance. So a lot of the funds are still remaining there and can be repurposed. And some of them are being used, 4.4 billion across all provinces, for trucking of water to refill tanks, which the education infrastructure grant, the school backlogs grant would have implemented or put in place, so they can truck water to fill in those tanks, and also sanitation. And importantly as well, I think the funding of salaries for EPWP workers to assist in screening of the day. But as Wendy indicated, the option with the municipalities, trucking of water is an expensive option. It's a short-term option. So in the future, we need to look at perhaps drilling of boreholes and installation of bulk supply of water. So that it's more cheaper and it's more sustainable in the long term. The school nutrition grant, so 50 million has been repurposed within this grant to provide for protection in terms of additional sanitation, especially in food preparation areas where food is being cooked and where it's being served as well, and to provide PPE for the food handlers as well. I think one of the most important points here is that although this grant is normally is normally implemented during schooling hours, there is now a provision that allows for schools to continue feeding even if the schools are closed. And this is quite important, especially in areas where some of the learners are dependent on these meals, especially. The learners with profound intellectual disabilities grant. So we're looking at 20 million across all provinces here to provide PPE to support the education of the children. Now, these children are very vulnerable. Most of them are not mobile at all, and they have severe disabilities. So it's actually very important that we provide and protect them as well, and the workers or the teachers who assist them. In terms of the Maths and Science and Technology grant and the HIV and AIDS Life Skills grant, so some money has been repurposed within that grant, so 70 million across both grants to provide for catch-up activities, especially with Maths and Science, which are gateway subjects as well, especially when you're going to university. So 30 million will be will be put aside or repurposed to catch up with any lost work during the first and second term of the school year. With the HIV and AIDS Life Skills Grant, so the purpose of this grant is actually to provide awareness and advocacy around HIV and AIDS. So 40 million of that will be taken or repurposed to provide advocacy and education around the pandemic. So to assist in that way. The next slide, please. So the Early Childhood Development Grant, which is administered by the Department of Social Development, there we repurposed 89 million rand across all provinces, and this is to prepare the sites for reopening. It also provides for a standard support package that will include basic health and hygiene products that can be provided for the learners as well. The Community Library Services Grant, 10 million has been repurposed here, especially to prepare for the libraries before they open. So it's for hand sanitizers, the provision of PPE for staff, and also it provides for deep cleaning. So before libraries are open, there is a allowance for each library to be deep cleaned, so that you can take in people from the public. The Public Transport Operations Grant. So this grant provides a subsidy for those who take buses and provide bus subsidy basically. So quite a big portion of this, 337 million. Well, it is a big grant anyway, but in terms of absolute amount, 337 million is taken away to provide to sanitize buses and the areas around the buses. It can also be used for the provision of PPE for public transport workers, for hand washing facilities, and also for physical distancing measures as well. The Mass Support and Participation Grant. Now, this grant as well, very little could have been done in the first two quarters of the financial year. This grant caters mostly for sporting activities in the community as well. And in most cases, it requires people to gather together. So because of physical distancing and social distancing measures, obviously these couldn't be implemented. So 58 million has been repurposed within this grant to compensate sport sector, so sports people and athletes especially, who had a loss of earnings because events had to be cancelled. So it's just to compensate them on that one day. The last one on this slide is the 378 million that was taken away from the Human Settlements grants, from the other two Human Settlements grants, which is the Human Settlements Development Grant and the Title Deeds Restoration Grant. And this was shifted to the Human Settlements, to the Provincial Emergency Housing Grant. This is to provide for emergency housing in case people need to social distance, but they can't because of circumstances. Okay. Now this obviously, because it's a provincial emergency grant, it needs to go through a quick process where the provincial Human Settlements Department, for example, will have to make a case to the National Department for funds to be released. So it has to follow a process, and it has to be verified as well by the Human Settlements Department. But obviously, because this is a Schedule 7 grant, it's not a protracted process. So it should happen as quickly as possible to provide for these people who need to social distance, but they can't. I think that's the last slide for me. Oh, no, sorry. If you can just go to the I think if you can skip this slide and go to slide 15. Now these two slides are mostly, it's the overall allocation, but I just want to focus on the allocations to KZN itself. Now these are the conditional grant allocations. Now, as Wendy indicated, the equitable share, if you look at the top line, has not been affected, so it remains the same. The changes do come on the conditional grants, and you'll see the reductions in the middle column there, total in the adjustments column. For example, you'll see the CAS grant loses around or just over 40 million, and the ILEMA LETSEMA loses around 80 million over there. Now, a lot of these grants, although we have reduced the funds, it does not impact directly on service delivery. For example, in agriculture, if I just give you one example, funds were not taken away. Funds were not taken away from activities that are going to have a direct impact on farmers, for example. So we looked at areas such as agricultural colleges where the spending was poor anyway, performance was poor, so we took away some money from there. And we look at other things such as events or activities that were planned, outreach events. So those things obviously can't take place. So that's where we reduced. In terms of extension services and direct support to farmers, that was not affected. So the farmers are not directly impacted. So that's just one example of the rationale we used when we reduced the grants. So if you go to the next page, slide 16. Okay, so you just see here, for example, I mentioned earlier that 446 million was added on the HIV and AIDS grant under the COVID-19 component. So you'll see it there, the 446 million rand. We indicated that the money was taken away from human settlements grants towards the provincial emergency grant. Now you'll see the emergency grant is actually showing zero at the moment. Now the reason for that is we don't know what the applications are going to be from provinces. So once we know the applications, and then we can allocate it. But currently the 378 million remains unallocated for now. So once we get the applications and it's approved, then we'll allocate that. So yeah, so that's basically the reductions, which amounts to 958 million rand over the 2021 financial year only. Yeah, I think that's it from the provincial perspective. I see my colleague Selo from local government is here, so with your permission, Chair, I would just like to hand over to him. Thank you.
Thanks, Emmanuel. Can we then hand over to Selo Mashaba for the as the component, the local government presentation? Thanks.
All right. Thanks, Emmanuel, and thanks to Wendy. Good morning to the members, and good morning to the chairperson. Yes, my name is Selo Mashaba, and I will be taking you through the local government component, specifically the 20 billion package that the president pronounced on. My presentation will largely focus on the split of the 20 billion between local government equitable share and conditional grants, and I think my last slide would then show the sort of summarized picture of local government reprioritization. Okay, with this first slide, it reflects the split of the 20 billion for the whole country. 11 billion has been allocated from the 20 billion for the local government equitable share, and the remainder of that, which is about 9 billion, is a reprioritization within existing conditional grants, and I'll talk to those just in a minute. In terms of the 11 billion, government has decided to sort of increase municipalities' share of the equitable share to cater for their operational expenses. This is largely due to the declining revenue for these municipalities. Obviously, with the lockdown, not much has been happening, and municipalities were struggling to raise revenue through rates and taxes. In fact, as Wendy was explaining earlier on, it was projected that between 40 to 60% was lost in revenue there. In terms of the conditional grants, an amount of 6.6 billion is being reprioritized within the following conditional grants, just to deal with the water and sanitation services infrastructure, We're thinking that we need to supplement municipalities for repairs and maintenance within this grant, just to assist them to deal with loss of revenues for provision of water and sanitation. So I've mentioned and listed the different conditional grants: the USDG Urban Settlement Development Grant, which goes to the metropolitan municipalities, and in the province it would be eThekwini. Then we've got the IUDG City of Mhlathuze benefits from that grant. Then the bigger portion of that money, 6.6 billion, goes to the municipal infrastructure grant, the regional bulk infrastructure grant as well, together with the water service infrastructure grant. So basically, all of these grant allocations in the 2021 allocation would be reprioritized to deal with short-term challenges that municipalities are experiencing as a result of COVID. The last bullet on the slide is the public transport network grant and the municipal infrastructure grant. Again, we are reprioritizing about 2.4 billion just to deal with sanitization of public transport. Next slide. In terms of this slide, I'm explaining a little bit on the equitable share in terms of what informs the 11 billion. We will be, in terms of how we'll allocate the 11 billion, we chose to utilize the existing component within the formula for the equitable share. And each municipality will have to determine how best to use their funds to respond to their local pressures. They know what's best or what are the services that have been impacted. We would also be focusing on monitoring these reprioritized funds through the municipal standard chart of accounts, and municipalities would be required to explicitly report through the newly created code that would report expenditure, and it's called the COVID-19 project code. In terms of the split, the two components within the formula of equitable share would benefit from that 11 billion. 7.5 billion of the basic services component is going to that item, and as a result of increased poorer household following the COVID, there will be an additional money allocated towards that. 1.4 million households have become poorer as a result of this, and hence a bigger portion of 7.5 billion is allocated. Again, and also the community services component sees about 3.5 billion to address issues of environmental health, cemeteries, and the crematoria services. Next slide. We also want to try to strike a balance between the urban and rural municipal areas in terms of where has the COVID affected the most areas. In terms of this table, members will see that the additional funding is actually addressing all municipal types. Metros in general are getting a bigger chunk because it is expected that a huge number of poor households are residing in those spaces. Rural municipalities are also getting as the second best recipient of the additional money, but largely all municipalities are benefiting, including even districts that are without powers and functions for water and services. They are also getting a portion, but a balance is being. We're striking a balance just to make sure that all municipalities are being remunerated in that regard. Next slide. In Okay, this slide reflects, if I can just take the members through the column. The first column is the budget column, the current 2020 budget. This column was what was tabled in February by the Minister of Finance. Since then, there's been a revision of what I've been talking about, the 11 billion. And just below the 11 billion, members will see an amount of 3.6 billion has been shifted or reprioritized from the conditional grants. We think that this money would in any event not be spent as a result of the lockdown. We think that since the lockdown, there's been slow take-up in terms of service delivery, and hence we are reprioritizing those conditional grants. And obviously the last column, which reads amount repurposed within the grants, those conditional grants within that column are not losing their funding. We're just repurposing how the funding will be utilized by focusing on short-term challenges of the municipalities. 4.4 billion of the municipal infrastructure grant is repurposed within the grant itself. Municipalities would be allowed a percentage to spend the MEAG portion on repairs and maintenance, and the USDG as well in terms of the metro and also the PTNG. The bottom part of the slide reflects the indirect conditional grants as well. They are also being repurposed. An amount of 1 billion from which is normally allocated within the ESCOM space is also being reprioritized just to assist in funding the 20 billion sketch that the president pronounced on. Next slide. Okay, the next set of tables reflect additional equitable share per district, and I suppose members would be interested in the slide, so I'll just quickly go through them. The Ugu district is seeing about an additional 170 million from 1.1 billion to 1.3 billion. Umgungundlovu is seeing 201 million. If you compare the two districts and the same approach you'd see as I continue, it's a relative increase across. The bigger allocation in a district would see slightly bigger additional allocation. And Utugela is seeing 167 million, and it takes them to 1.2 billion from 1 billion. Umzinyati district municipalities are seeing a total of 145 million, from 894 million to about 1 billion, and a little more. Amajuba district, 101 million is added from their 706 million. You'll see that Newcastle there is the biggest beneficiary, but if you look at their their main allocation, they are also, in terms of the formula, they get more allocation than the rest. Zululand, 200 million in addition, and they ultimately have 1.4 billion. Umkhanyakude, an additional 188 million. That takes them to 1.3 billion. Next slide. There's about 10 districts in the province. Kingzejwayo sees 197 million to 1.7 billion, and you can see the split between the various local municipalities there. 183.7 million as an additional money goes to Ilembe. And the last district, Herigwala, sees an additional 143.5 million. And in total, KZN is seeing about 2.2 billion of that 11 billion from the main allocation of 14.6 billion to 16.8. So this is the additional equitable share that has been pronounced by the president on the 20 billion, and the KZN province takes about 2.2 billion of that. And this should be my last slide, Chairperson. it reflects the difference between infrastructure allocations and direct transfers, indirect transfers, and even capacity transfers. So basically, the first group of grants reflects what has been reprioritized. If you can just zoom in the middle there, an amount of 191 million and 124 million, and that 13.3 million has been reprioritized. In the main, all of that money, which is about 340 million, has been reprioritized from eThekwini. The bigger allocation that municipalities in KZN will be losing this year as a result of reprioritization is for the National Electrification Program for an amount of 93 million. There we're saying that we are not expecting, as a result of the lockdown, a lot of upscale services for electrification program, just as a result, just in the current year. But this should, the allocation should correct itself in future. The same thing, it's also realized under the indirect portion of the allocation, about 238 million of the Eskom INEP program is also being reprioritized. So in total, KZN loses about 666.5 million just to fund reprioritization within the baseline. Thank you, Chairperson.
Thank you, Chairperson. We finished with our presentation from National Treasury side. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Selo. Let me just now hand over, we are now on the item of discussions on this presentation. Let me hand over to our chairperson, Honorable Nkosi, who I see has joined the meeting.
No, sorry, Honorable Member, may you continue with the meeting, otherwise I will mislead the meeting because I missed a lot.
Okay, no, fine. Colleagues, the floor is now open for discussion. What we will do is we'll follow a procedure of the raising of hands. So if colleagues can raise their hands, then I will then recognize you and allocate as per that. I see the hand of Honorable Rogers. Anybody else? Honorable Nlotshwa, Honorable Madlopa. I have 3 hands here. Okay, fine. Let's take it in that order. We'll start with Honorable Rogers, then Honorable Nlotshwa, and then Honorable Madlopa. Thanks.
Thank you, Chairperson. And let me say that I'm glad Honorable KK has relinquished his position as Chair. You're a much nicer face and much prettier face to look at. So I welcome his stepping down. On a serious note, Chairperson, a couple of questions I want to ask. On the slide dealing with the impact on national finances, the little block table in the bottom left corner, am I understanding that correctly, that since 2014-15, we haven't been able to generate the revenue that we predicted or that we budgeted we would be generating? And then just a question of clarity on slide 4 and slide 5. Slide 4 talks about the President announced that the 130 billion would be reprioritized. 30 billion of this was to come from provinces. If I look at slide 5, it talks about provinces have committed to reprioritize at least 20 billion. And then it gives us the table on the bottom right of the page. So the 30 billion, how exactly, how is that going to come off our equitable share allocation? I'm a bit confused because it's also reflected on that table on the bottom of page 5, but that's 20 billion and the previous page talks about 30 billion. So if I could be given some sort of understanding there. Then, Chairperson, just looking at the scenario with municipalities and the post-pandemic sort of economic fallout and revenues dropping between 40 and 60%. So my question to National Treasury on the bailout, the 11 billion of which KZN is getting 2.1 billion, is how's that 2.1 billion calculated? Have they taken what they believe an estimated drop in revenue would be and calculated that bailout based on that? Exactly how have they calculated that 11 billion translating into 2.1 for KZN? Is it on the loss of revenue, or is that something or a challenge that we're still going to face as municipalities and as a province going forward? Then just one other question also relates to municipalities. Just at the outbreak and when we went into lockdown, National Treasury put out a regulation, I think it was Regulation 100, dealing with COVID-19 expenditure and municipalities and the regulations surrounding that expenditure. My question to National Treasury is, who is monitoring those regulations? Is it a national prerogative, or are the MECs of finance in the provinces supposed to? For example, the one question comes to mind is within 30 days, municipalities have had to table any COVID relief expenditure to their executive committees undertaken during this period. And as far as I'm aware, it's not happening. So I just want a bit of clarity around that. And then my last question is something, when we got this presentation during the NCOP briefing on DORA, there was a part of the presentation was about National Treasury is going to be undertaking zero-based budgets moving forward. Is that going to happen throughout provinces, or is that purely a decision taken at national level? Thanks, Chair. I'll leave it at that.
Thanks, Honourable Rogers. Can we go to Honourable Mlotshwa?
Honourable Chairperson, can you hear me?
Yes, you are quite audible, Honourable Mlotshwa.
No, thanks, Honourable Chairperson. I think Honourable Rogers Mhlekazi has taken most of my points that I have to raise. I'll not repeat what he has said because he has taken on. But with regards to public transport operation grant of 337 million, as well as at that slide of 20 billion where public transport network grant for sanitization, what I want to check, because if I read it here, it seems as if it is directed to buses. What about taxis? Because it's where hazard is. Because I've been in most of the taxi ranks, whereby there are no sanitizers. Everything is a hazard there. So what I'm asking, is there a share for taxis as well to this amount of money that has been allocated for transport?
Honourable Mlotshwa, are you done?
Yes, Honourable Chairperson, I'm done.
Okay, thanks. So yours was around the subsidy or support to taxis. Let me go to Honourable Madlopa.
Thanks, Honorable Chair. We welcome the presentation from the three presenters. Mine, Chair, I think I wanted to get a formula, but I think Honorable Rogers have raised that one. I wanted to understand the formula that they are using to allocate that 20 billion to different municipalities, because we understand that is no more 20 billion, is now 11 billion. But I think Rogers covered me. I was looking for the formula. And on the other one, I was also checking, Honorable Chair, the allocations to the provinces of 130 billion, where 30 billion is supposed to come from the provinces. But what I want to check, because they are saying that now it's like they will recover that one from the equitable share. What I want to check is that now the formula that will be used to allocate to different provinces, and then it will be less by that 30 billion, and also what formula they're going to use in that one to try and allocate or to take that equitable share from the different provinces. And lastly, Chair, is around the issue of 30 million and 40 million that is going to be repurposed for education measures to respond to the lost time. What I'm asking, what is exactly is going to be utilized for this money? I'm asking this because we have got schools that are in the deep rural areas. If we are saying we are going to try and assist, especially those that do maths and science, how is it going to be utilized, that money? Because I'm not sure whether is this one that is going to be used for to use the internet to try and recover, or it is direct. Because if it is like that, it's going to exclude those kids that are in the deep rural areas. We want to know exactly how is it going to be utilized. Thanks, Chair.
Thanks, Honorable Madlopa.
Sorry, Chair,
Yes.
the last one, yes. The one that is for agriculture, the grant also that is going to be utilized. I was happy to hear that the farmers are not going to be affected because it's not going to deal directly with the support that they are getting. But what I want to check, because also when you talk about the money that is going to deal with the training, the government is having a challenge of the capacity. To me, it's not just like it's not going to affect the service delivery, because also for people to get skills is a service delivery to me. So this is my concern, Chair, to say that even though it's not directly, especially to affect the farmers on the support they are getting, but at the same time, around the issue of training is it's a problem if it is going to be taken away, because it's taking away the capacity. Thanks, Chair.
Thanks, Honorable Madlopa. You seem to be the last. I don't see any other hands. Let me then hand over to Treasury. You'll see that you'll have to divide this between yourselves, because some of the issues raised deal with the provincial allocations and others with local government. So I'm not sure who's going first.
I'll go first, and I've got the fortunate ability to redirect questions to others as well, which is very nice. Thank you very much for all the questions. And I'm glad that we've been given an opportunity also to clarify some of the things that we could maybe have stressed a bit better, particularly from my side. Maybe what I should go with, because it's an issue that's been raised quite a bit, the 30 billion versus the 20 billion and how the money is going to be taken out. The 30 billion was the amount announced by the president, that it will be, the provincial equitable share will be reduced by 30 billion. And in our deliberations, because we had at that stage, we had weekly meetings with the provincial treasuries, and we discussed the issues with them, and they went back to the drawing board, and the provincial treasuries came back to us and said, we cannot do 30 billion, it's just too much, our budget hasn't got that room to reprioritize 30 billion, because and the other discussion we had with them is whether we're going to take the money out and let National do the reprioritization, or whether we keep the money within the provincial equitable share, and that we then allow provinces to do the reprioritization themselves. So based on the discussions that we had with the provincial treasuries, the first thing is we then as a collective decided, and we fed it back into the cabinet process when the Division of Revenue Amendment Bill was discussed as well, and we indicated to cabinet that we cannot take up 30 billion out of provincial budgets, but in negotiations with the provincial treasuries, it was deemed that the amount of 20 billion would be more feasible for them to reprioritize. So what is happening is that we're not reducing from national government side. There's no impact on the total amount that will go to provinces in terms of their provincial equitable share amount. So the amount that was announced in the 2020-21 budget in February remains unchanged for provincial treasuries. But what is important there, although the amount remains unchanged, provincial treasuries, together with their sector departments, had to go back to the drawing board and saying, okay, in terms of the allocations that we've got available, how can we actually, as a province, repurpose that money towards COVID-19 related expenditure? And 15 billion out of that had to be repurposed for health, and 5 billion had to be repurposed in terms of other COVID-19 responsibilities. Because in our discussions with the provincial treasuries, originally health was identified as a key constraint for provinces to deal with to respond to COVID-19. But in our discussions, it was determined there's other sectors that's also impacted by COVID-19, and that is why 5 billion is also repurposed towards that purpose. So it does have an impact on how the budgets are configured in terms of provinces, and the provincial treasury